So welcome everybody on to the seminar today. My name is Nina Schomburg and I am the coordinator for this Nature Recovery Networks project here that these webinars are part of. And I have to say I'm really excited just to see that the sheer number of us on the call today. It's fantastic to see so much interest. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to attend. It's great to have you on. I'm just going to go, hopefully if I can change my slide. There we go. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the exciting stuff. You should hopefully all have the today's agenda, but Laura and Monica, if you can put that linked in the chat as well, just as a reminder if you've lost it somewhere in your emails. Apart from the three talks today, we're going to be having the Q&A at the end, and we've also prepped a couple of polls that we will be launching throughout the day. We hope that these polls really will help us to learn a little bit more about who we have in the audience today and how really we might best approach our work going forward. So please do respond to them. It's all anonymous, so we won't be getting a record of individual answers, or it won't be shown on the screen. So we're using the Zoom's webinar setup today. What that means is that only the hosts and the presenters will have their cameras and mics on automatically. It would of course be really nice if we could have a little bit more face-to-face interaction, but just with the sheer number of you on the call, I think we are at 80 people now. It's unfortunately a little bit impossible to coordinate that all effectively. So we are recording the sessions and we'll be sharing them on a public platform on a later date. So if you do have any concerns on that, do let me know, and you'll find my contact details at the very last slide at the end of the webinar. I have two wonderful helping hands on the call today, Monica and Laura. Can you give a quick wave? Super. And so if you're having any trouble, please use the wave functionality in the chat and they will do their best to give you a hand. Feel free to also use the chat functionality for chatting amongst yourselves, sharing links and so on. That's really what it's there for as well. In terms of the Q&A, if you want to pose a question to one of the speakers, please use the Q&A functionality rather than the chat. Like I said, with the number of you in attendance today, it could be likely that we won't be able to go through them all. So for that, please use there's a thumbs up functionality which will allow you to upvote questions. And with that, we can then start to prioritize those questions that I will then post to the panel during the Q&A. I will touch upon this in a little bit more detail when we get to the Q&A itself. So lastly, in case we do have any tweeters in the room today, please use the hashtag Nature Recovery Networks NI and do tag us at NRN_NI into your tweets. Actually, before we do get any further than this, I think it would be quite nice to launch the first two polls just to see who we actually have in the audience today. Could you do that, Monica and Laura? Interesting. We were talking about this earlier as well, how many people we have coming from different places. So definitely huge majority is tuning in from Northern Ireland, but we've got a few people coming from Scotland and England as well. And quite a few from the Republic. That's great. And people seem to be at least somewhat familiar with with the concept even ahead of the webinars, which is, it's nice to see. So if you could just take a record of that, Monica and Laura, I think we are slowing down on the votes, and that's almost everybody who's voted. And then we'll head on with the rest of my little introduction. I'll end the poll if that's okay. There we go. Or you do that, please. So 82% from Northern Ireland. Okay. Right, I'll keep going ahead. So there we go. So why have we actually invited you here today? Since September last year, RSBB and I, Ulster Wildlife National Trust and Woodland Trust have been working together on this capacity building project around nature recovery networks. This partnership really is outworkings of this Landscape Conservation Partnership Agreement, which was signed on a UK level a couple of years ago. Basically, what the four organizations decided to do as part of this was to really join their forces and make sure that they work together and influence the way we look after our environment, and especially making sure that that's done at a landscape scale. So with generous funding from the Lottery Heritage Fund, we have now here in Northern Ireland embarked on this journey to explore and put in place mechanisms really that will enable this sort of an approach to be adopted into policy and practice. As part of the project, we will be conducting a national scale mapping exercise in order to increase our understanding on what our current land cover is like, and also beyond this to highlight where there's potential and to start where there's potential to start enhancing the existing network of habitats, whether that might be through restoration or creation of habitats. And beyond that, we will also be obviously advocating for the adoption of the concept into policy and practice, and will produce case studies and facilitate knowledge sharing within the sector. And that's obviously exactly why we're here today. Of course, while we might have the four organizations leading on the project, this project in particular, we are of course talking about something that within which we could all have a role to play in. But why are we talking about nature recovery networks? Probably all of us here are quite aware of the fact that our environment is struggling, and this is largely driven by habitat loss and fragmentation, in addition to the likes of pollution and climate change, of course, as well. To put this into context, the 2019 State of the Nature report stated that Northern Ireland is in fact the 12th worst in the world when it comes to biodiversity loss. With that in mind, there's quite a compelling case to be made to actually rethink how we look after our environment going forward. So why are we talking about nature recovery networks in this context? This sort of thinking really stems, sorry, I must have jumped over a slide. So this sort of thinking really stems from the 1970s, and understanding that the long-term persistence and resilience of metapopulations of species is fundamentally governed by both the distribution of habitats and the distribution of populations and these links amongst them. Further evolution of the thinking, especially in relation to the interconnectedness of and distribution of these metapopulations and networks over the wider landscape, supported that there is a need really for what has since been called ecological networks. This then eventually led to the IUCN adopting a resolution on ecological networks, and that was at the 1996 World Conservation Congress, and that was soon followed by the CBD conferences of the parties. While some countries in Europe, for example, Estonia and the Netherlands, just to name a few, have had work officially going on since the 1990s. In the UK, while a lot of relevant work has been undertaken, it's only really in the last couple of years that there has been this has been receiving wide-scale momentum and policy support as well. That has largely been driven by a landmark report from 2010 called Making Space for Nature, which was by Sir Lawton and his colleagues. And what did this report do was that it really put in black and white how the current approach that we have towards looking after our environment, and that how it just isn't enough to safeguard biodiversity, highlighting the need to bring about bigger, better, and more connected habitats for wildlife. And these are the 4 Lawton principles that some of you might have heard of before. So now the right time for this slide. So fundamentally, ecological networks really is a concept that is a culmination of an array of insights into how we can look at conservation and how more specifically doing that effectively. And what this means that it's an approach where where critical areas are being protected, biodiversity is being looked after at a landscape scale, or at least regional scale. But further than that, the emphasis being on ecological coherence, especially through delivering connectivity between habitat patches, like I touched upon. But beyond that, making sure that these critical areas for biodiversity are also being buffered from the effects of damaging external activities. What is key here really is working towards something, a network of ecologically important areas that are functionally and not just structurally connected. So when designing ecological networks, then this would really entail highlighting core areas. So where do we already have important sites for wildlife in the shape of protected areas and habitats and nature reserves, for example? Where there are and where there could be corridors and stepping stones to connect these imported habitat patches. And then where are there appropriate conditions to actually restore and create habitats, eventually then becoming these core areas. And then how can we make the wider landscape as well more permeable, moving away from these core areas. And this could be through the likes of green infrastructure, and a delivery mechanism for this, for example, could be agri-environment support, as an example. So beyond this then, while we obviously want the primary role of this being supporting biodiversity, there's really an acknowledgement that has been made in the last couple of years that we should also highlight where there's opportunities for joint benefits for people as well. And this could be, this is really what we call ecosystem services. So examples of that being flood alleviation, recreational opportunities, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and so on. And that's what we call now nature recovery networks, and why we have really adopted that as a, I guess, our working concept for the project. So where does this then really leave us today? We really think that what we have at hand here is an extremely unique opportunity to take a step back and really to evaluate what do we really want our future to look like, especially in the context of what has taken place in the last 12 to 13, or is it 14 months now with COVID, and for us, obviously, with Brexit as well. So we keep on talking about needing to build back better, but how do we then ensure that this also includes greener? We already obviously have building blocks for this with DRS Green Growth Strategy, and also the £2 million Green Recovery Fund that was recently allocated to Northern Ireland from the Department of Finance. But we also need to make sure that these are utilized strategically. Beyond COVID and Brexit, this project really has come at a very relevant time. 2021, obviously having launched the UN Decade of Restoration, COP15 taking place in China in October, in addition to Scotland hosting COP26 in Glasgow in November. And obviously, as part of that, UK is holding the UNFCCC presidency alongside the G7 presidency as well this year. So in this context, there's an obvious case to be made to make sure of this, to really make sure that we use this momentum and this platform as well. And as part of this, Northern Ireland really could showcase that it's putting its the long-term well-being of its environment and its people into the forefront of its future. So what we really have at hand at the moment is a great opportunity to influence our national policy with Brexit in mind, especially. And beyond that, so obviously we have the post-CAP agri-environment support, but there's also undergoing consultation on the Northern Ireland Climate Change Bill, the Environment and Nature Restoration Bill, and so on. So great potential to influence those at the moment. So, but also thinking then the details of this legislation, making sure that at the heart of this, we would have a system that is striving towards having statutory targets at their core, and duty really to act and are key. So, and what we think is that nature recovery networks could play a key role in facilitating this and helping them to maximize benefits both for wildlife and people. And it could really act as a mechanism really to integrate nature and nature-based solutions effectively across government and policy. But of course, we don't want to be talking about just yet another new thing, but rather we want to be talking about something that is long-term and it's going to be effective. While obviously this sounds understandably like a huge challenge, at the same time, we should be looking at this from the angle of it being also an incredible opportunity to more specifically an opportunity to not make it a problem, but actually a solution. So we also have quite a unique position here in Northern Ireland with the fact that we have this luxury of now learning from others, some of those people being on the call today, and then through that making sure that we approach and our project and this concept from an angle that will then make our own approach fit for purpose for Northern Ireland. Obviously, Northern Ireland is also quite small, so that if we then were smart about how we were to bring about this concept, it should not just be possible, but also quite manageable, we think. So lastly, what is the aim for today? While all of the things I've mentioned in the previous slides give us a great platform really to for this sort of work, what we really need is to do our own thinking when it comes then to what this all could, but most importantly, should look like in practice. So what we want as part of this webinar series is really to capture the imagination of the wider sector when it comes to what nature recovery networks could actually represent for Northern Ireland. So to help with this, we've obviously brought to you this wonderful set of speakers today and at our other two seminars, who have been lovely and taking their time and to talk to us about their experiences about ecological or nature recovery networks. So if I could really ask you all on the call today to take the opportunity to engage and to ask questions throughout the session, and then we can start thinking about what nature recovery networks could be for us here in Northern Ireland. So to get to the more exciting stuff, I'm going to do a quick introduction to our first speaker, Rob Youngman. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can start working on putting your presentation up, Rob. So our first speaker today is Dr. Rob Youngman, and he will be tuning in all the way from the Netherlands. While Rob is officially retired, when I first reached out to him, he promptly announced that retirement does not mean that you stop thinking, writing, and communicating, which obviously we are very grateful for today. Rob is a leading expert in Europe in the field of nature conservation planning, ecological networks, and green infrastructure. After having developed experience in practical conservation at regional level, he was based at the Wageningen University of Research Center. I hope I didn't butcher that, Rob. Since 1990, Rob has been involved in developing the concept of ecological networks as a strategy for biodiversity conservation and nature planning in Europe and beyond. He's published many papers and book contributions on ecological networks, wetland conservation, and biodiversity monitoring. And in 2019, he also published, together with his US colleagues, an analysis paper on 30 years of planning ecological networks, mainly based on American and European projects. And we will be putting a link to that paper in the chat. He's also been the co-lead of GeoBon, the GeoTask on setting up a global biodiversity and ecosystem services monitoring system. After his retirement, he has also been a visiting professor in Brazil at UNEM at Mato Grosso, in Japan at the University of Hiroshima, and Estonia at the University of Life Sciences, Tartu. While most of this has naturally been on hold due to COVID, I'm sure he hopes that this can resume as soon as possible in the future. So the floor is yours, Rob.
Thank you. I will share my screen with you and do a presentation on, you can hear me? Okay, good. Okay. I will take you on a tour of 30 years ago on the development of the Dutch ecological network and other ecological networks in Europe, and tell you something about the lessons we learned. You have to, if you want to know the reason why you work with ecological networks or recovery networks, then you have to realize that there is about 50 years or even more intensification of land use in all of Europe. It's larger scale farming, more isolated, inaccessible natural land, homogenization, abandonment of non-profitable farmland, fragmentation by roads, railways, buildings, etc. I'll give you some examples of that.
Rob, sorry, were you wanting to share your screen? Because we just see your face at the moment.
Oh, I thought I shared it. Wait a moment.
No problem.
There we go. Let's see, where do I share? Let's go back here. Share again. Share the screen. Share. Do you have it now? Do I share now? Yeah? This okay? Okay.
Yes, good.
Okay, there we go. Yes. So what I said, there's an intensification of land use since a long time. Homogenization of larger farming lands, fragmentation of the natural remnants of our nature, and a marginalization of land, the homogenization of abandonment of non-profitable farmlands, and fragmentation by building of roads, railways, etc. I'll give you some examples. The connectivity in the landscape declines because of scale enlargement agriculture resulting in less hedgerows, less small forest, the regulation of rivers. So everywhere in Europe, rivers have been regulated. And at the moment still, you see that this kind of processes are very important in the Balkan, in Romania, it goes from the center, the urbanized part of Europe. Now the more remote parts are also being isolated, destructed, etc. And we also see that there is a decline in isolation of small wetland biotopes. Roadside verges. When I came first time to Great Britain, there were all kind of cuts in spending, and roadside verges were not longer managed. That's not bad for some species, but for some others, it's very bad because you cannot move through unmanaged. Some species cannot move through there. In Europe, there's a decline of stone walls, and in Great Britain, they had this regulation to keep stone walls and hedgerows. But in all of Europe, there is a decline of it. If you look at this is an example of Moravia. Between 1842 and 1954, there's not so much change. There is change. Things are changing. You see boats, but if you look at 1990, then the land suddenly very much changed. Or you can say that's the communist era, but that's not only that, because this is Spain. The Picos de Europa used to be in 1993 a nice small-scale landscape with all ash trees, candelabras, ash trees, and that has been abandoned on the hillside and intensified land use in the valley. That means there is a big change in how the land is going to be used and what is available for wildlife and for nature. In the Netherlands, you are in an urbanized part of Europe, and you see there we have all kinds of barriers, urbanization, railroads, roads, and glass houses for farming. That all makes the life for wildlife, for our animals and our wild species, much more difficult. And you have to take that into account if you want to protect nature, if you want to keep it, then you have to do something about it. In that period, in the period in the 70s, badgers in the Netherlands declined to a small population of about 3,000-4,000. Now, so you have to do something about it. And what you see in the other process is the climate that is changing. The birds, this is the woodpecker here, is living here in the red and green part, but the red part is going to be not suitable for this species, and it will move north. It moves more it stays in the green part, and will also move to the east and the north, the south of Scandinavia, Denmark, and the Netherlands. This is what is going on. And to make that possible for that animal to do it, to escape the non-accessible areas, you have to take care that it can move to new habitats and that there is a connectivity for the species to go. In the Netherlands, how can we my writing is just behind the bar, but we have a lot of wetlands in the Netherlands. And these wetlands are important for 127 bird species. And we have a international responsibility for many of them, 91. And for 55 species, we have more than 10% of the world population. And we have 50,000 hectares of wetlands divided over 1,500 sites. But the point is, through all the land use changes, 80% is smaller than 10 hectares. And much of these areas that could be used are not used then because it's fragmented and not accessible. That means you have to do things. Even the large marshes that we have are too small for most species, but all the marshes together are big enough. So the problem is marsh complexes in the Netherlands are so far apart that even the more mobile species cannot bridge the gap. They cannot get there. And the habitats are too small for their populations to, to stay there, to live there in a more permanent way. So there's no connectivity between all these sites. That means that otters have disappeared in the 80s. The last ones were in about 1980, and other birds of the wetlands are also gone, and others as well. That means what we have to do, and that's what we decided, we have to connect nature, reinforce the spatial coherence of nature. Because if you invest in nature by conservation, that should be effective. And if you do it only in small parts, and you can do it better if you connect nature with the small parts through linkages, then you have a better effectiveness of your investments in conservation. Your species are moving in. The otter, the white-tailed, the eagle are coming in, coming back, and that means to do that, it means that we need experts, landscape ecology experts, and conservation planning experts to make the model to show the managers, the land, nature, and land managers how it should be done. And that means that the government should be aware of it and say and should be able and willing to fund and support this kind of conservation activities. And that only can be done, as we saw in our publication of 2019. We analyzed about a small, nearly 300 projects, and you see that NGOs are very important to keep nature managers, land managers, and the government sharp in how to in continuing the funding and investment in nature. And you need support also from civil society, because if you want to make a hedgerow or a small forest somewhere, then civil society should support it, because how would they allow you to do that? So it's their land partly. That means what then happened in the Netherlands in the 80s of last century, we had a kind of inventory of where is nature available, how big is it, for which species, and how could we improve this nature, the connectivity of it, and how could we enlarge it. That means in this map, this is the first map of the Dutch Ecological Network. The yellow ones are the core areas of the ecological network, and the blue ones are the rivers that are also core areas, and the green parts are parts of which we saw that there should be a connection, there should be expanding of this core network. And everywhere you see arrows, here, there, on the map, there are arrows, linkages. We should make linkages between some areas as they are too far apart and there's no connection between them. If you don't do that, then species will still disappear here, because this part, this Amsterdam, this is The Hague, Rotterdam, they're all urbanized, and the rest is agriculture, and species cannot move through. Okay. The plan, the national network, ecological network, is designed in 1990 and was thought to be realized in 2018. It was not realized then. But I come back to that. You need support and action from the national and the regional governments, because the national government can do things, and I show you later on that the regional government should do something as well, because There are national roads and there are regional roads, and there are national activities and there are regional activities. It's an important role for conservation NGOs. They showed they manage land, at least in the Netherlands, and they push the government and they make plans and they have ideas about it. And there was a progress then in the 1990s. And what you see, you get a stagnation after 2000 because we were in the process of decentralization. There was a financial crisis, but at the moment, it's more or less realized. It will be realized in the next, the last part will be done in a simpler way than planned in 2000, in 1990. It will be realized in the coming years. But there's still success. And that's what you get if you do this recovery of your nature coherency, then you get possibilities for dispersal, for migration. Dispersal, that means the range extension, the species, the woodpecker that moves through Europe to the north has to extend its range and find new habitats to go. I don't know how this is in the island of in Ireland, but you have to think about how far species have to move, could move, how are there species that have a need for dispersal. There's migration. A lot of species migrate to escape adverse environmental conditions, the winter or in our countries, it's mostly the winter. And they go foraging, movement between the nest and the feeding grounds. We have a very important foraging movements in the Netherlands when geese are around because they are cormorants. They move between the one spot where they sleep to the other spot where they have their feeding grounds. And for reproduction, frogs, toads move from winter sites to reproduction sites. And that's always a difficult thing for toads, especially if you have roads with a lot of traffic that they have to cross. So that was these are the things that you have to think about, the reasons why you need this connectivity between habitats through suitable corridors. You can think, and then you have your ecologists and your landscape architects who say, well, let's make a model of the landscape, model the landscape for a badger or martyr or whatever, and then you come, if you have the conditions, that's the requirements of these species, then this landscape here for the badger is a matrix with open spaces of about 500 meters, small scale agriculture with water elements, and here we decided to model it 5% forest. This is a very important picture to show the civil society and the government what is required for such a species. So it's a picture to talk about. And you can show there the roads, where are industrial plants, how can you mitigate here this water, this urban area, how can you mitigate it with corridors, tunnels, and ecoducts? That means you have to design this kind. This is the first one that we designed for a road in the Netherlands. This is what you should have for badgers. And it was very successful because the badger population in the Netherlands very well recovered since the beginning of the 90s and is now and we made this kind of tunnels and they can move through under the motorways through these tunnels. And the forest we just planted here, and there's an old one, this is from 1993. So, and the badgers are used them and other species as well. One of the things is that you have that if you do it large scale, this is Utrecht, the province of Utrecht, the center of the Netherlands, and there's a lot of urban areas here. This is small villages, but there are also bigger ones. This is the motorway, east-west. This is to a motorway to the northeast. This is here is a railway. Here's a local roads, regional roads. So it's a very complex area with urbanization, roads, railways, and you want to connect this nature area with the nature down here or with the nature down here. That means that you have to design bridges for the animals. And the problem is also this is a national motorway. This is a province. This is the responsibility for this one is to the province, the regional government. Well, the national government has the money, has the budget, but before they could realize this connectivity here, there was first the need that the national government and the regional governments sat together and shared the budget for building this kind of nature connectivities. So, and then you get this kind of bridges. Here's the rail, here's the railroad going from Utrecht to Amersfoort. And this is the bridge for animals to move, for red deer and roe deer, to move over the railroad. And also, well, he said, well, let's make a cycling path here as well. And the cycling path goes there as well. So this is a combined ecoduct for wildlife and for outdoor recreation, for cycling. So this is where this is realized. But it took about 15 to 20 years from 1990 on. This is in 2008 this was realized. So it takes time to get there. And the author, it goes back. Oh, wait a moment. The author was this was as was extinct in the 70s and end of the 70s. And the Ecological Network of the Netherlands showed that there were a lot of marshes and rivers where it could live. Only the things were you have to improve the quality of the water, you have to and you have to improve the connectivity. It has been reintroduced in 2002 here in this part of the Netherlands, and now it has a healthy population in the north of the Netherlands, and it's expanding to the south along the rivers. So if you restore connectivity of water, then otters come back and can survive. Also in an urban area, an urban country like the Netherlands. And you get this kind of, if you do it for crested newts, you can also design a landscape for it. And you can, this is the original landscape. And you can make a better part of the landscape for the crested newt if you make new ponds, and if you restore ponds, or we make new ones or restore them and connect them. That is what you have to discuss also with the landowners, because if this is land from a farmer, you have to discuss and to convince him that this is good for him and or that he can, if he wants to. So you have to find the right farmers who want to do this, and and also convince them with good arguments that this is a nice thing for also for this part of the countryside. We did do this in the Netherlands. We did do this all over Europe. We did also worked in Cheshire, and we designed also the Cheshire Econets. And here you see what you need. If you want to build green infrastructure, you need landscape ecological knowledge and put it into a GIS environment to say, well, what do you have to design? You have to engage stakeholders, because the farmers and the land managers are the important stakeholders and the municipality are important to to go with it, to accept the plan. So you have to communicate, you have to disseminate what you want, you have to communicate and with them. And you have to make an integrated land management plan. Because if you have to know, especially in the areas in the land where that is not only forest or not only nature, not like a big bog or whatever. If you have agricultural lands and you want to have nature there, then you have to have an integrated land management plan and the instruments to do it. I don't know what after Brexit are now all the instruments of the UK, but there are a lot of instruments that used to be available at national and European level before the Brexit. But you have to get anyway to sustainable land use management plan. It's a sustainable land use management. That means you have to look at what are the environmental schemes. Can you work on nature restoration? In the most European countries you can. We have large rivers that have to be restored, the re-meandering, the floodplains. You have to look at the weirs and dams. At the moment, in the city of Utrecht, there's a dam, there's in the canals, there's a kind of system that fish can push open a kind of weir so that they can move through the canals through the city. There has to be adapted road management, because you need tunnels. A road is a connectivity, connecting to towns or to villages, but it's breaking the connection between two natural areas. You have to get adapted road management. You have to have then also a regional dialogue on ecology and economy. Ecology is not something, and nature conservation is not something outside agriculture. It's not something outside road planning. It's not something outside water management. It's inside, because we all make use of water and make use of the land. That means you need stakeholders. This was in Cheshire, where our Cheshire colleagues, worked with the mayor and the local society. You see the communication at the back, and what they said there, the social network is as important as the ecological network if you want to realize nature recovery networks. So that means you have to talk normal. An ongoing program of habitat regulation and maintenance. Well, what do the people say? What your stakeholders say? Well, he's cutting a hedge, or he's managing a hedge. Explain and share your concept. Disseminate your findings and results. Organize meetings, local meetings and workshops, and talk to people, and publicize what you've done, and share it again to the scientific community, to the NGOs, but also to the civil society. And therefore you need seminars, your website and your social media. And then I think in the end, you will get a very nice project done, but it takes time, and it takes a long time. We are working on it now for 30 years, and in many places in the US, in Europe, there's long time work to get ecological networks or recovery network, nature recovery networks done, and therefore it needs the NGO that can stick to it and can keep the governments, the regional government and the national governments awake and aware of it. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Rob. That was an excellent start to the day, I would say. So thank you very, very much for taking the time for us today. I think in the context of that, at this point, it would be actually very interesting for us to launch our second poll, in relation to what Rob had talked about in terms of different stakeholders that should be involved in this sort of work, and who should partner up really. So it would be really nice to see basically who do we have represented today, just to see kind of where the interest on this webinar is coming from as well. So we'll just give that a few moments. Thanks again, Rob.
Okay.
A nice spectrum there. It's good to see that we've got all these different stakeholders involved, but mostly you can see NGO, local authorities, councils. That's great. So it's nice to see that spectrum. We'll give it just a few more seconds, and then we'll move on. And we'll obviously be taking record of all of these, because they will really help us to understand what, you know, is the best approach for us going forward with our work and all that, and how we engage and should engage going forward. I think we'll leave it as that. If you could just launch the results. Yep. So 45% NGO, but great contributions from local authorities and government departments. It's great to see private landowners and students on the call today. That's brilliant. Can you just stop sharing that, and we'll move on, Laura and Monica? Excellent. Thank you very, very much for all the responses. So next up, before we have our wee break, we have Stuart Gardner talking to us. Stuart works as the West of England Nature Partnership Manager, and he's responsible for leading the development, management and implementation of the partnership's aims and outcomes under the direction of the board. The partnership's aim, the partnership is currently focusing on delivering nature recovery networks for the West of England, which Stuart is driving towards within the partners and other key stakeholders in the region. He's also leading the production of a tree and woodland strategy for the West of England, which he will be touching upon in his presentation. Stuart previously worked as a management consultant in the aviation industry before completing his MSc in environmental technology, specializing in environmental resource management at Imperial College London. He also maintains a strong interest in nature outside of work, being a keen walker and wildlife watcher, and that's what we all like, don't we? So Stuart, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nina. Just check, can you see my screen okay?
Yep, all Excellent. Good.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nina. Yeah, so I'm Stuart. I manage the West of England Nature Partnership. The West of England Nature Partnership, there are a number of local nature partnerships across England that were prescribed in the Localism Act in 2011. Effectively, they're a key commitment from government, which highlighted the need to work together in a more joined up strategic manner in local regions to drive positive change in a local natural environment, and also to help contribute towards delivering the national government's objective across England for the natural environment. So the idea is that these local nature partnerships become local champions influencing decision-making relating to the natural environment and its value by bringing together local authorities, environmental NGOs, and generally environmental stakeholders across the region to work together in partnership. So you can see the region the West of England's Nature Partnership covers. It's effectively Bristol, Bath, surrounding areas. So it's a mix of quite large urban areas, but also quite significant rural areas as well. So we work across the spheres of spatial planning, public health and economic development, although that remit is broadening slightly. That was the original remit. We are touching on things like agriculture increasingly and land use. And we're set up to restore the natural environment in the west of England through embedding the value of nature in decision making across spatial planning, public health, and economic development. So we're working, for instance, with local authorities in their planning. We have a work stream on nature and health, mainstreaming health in in the health sector. I won't touch on that too much today. And also on economic development, so things such as natural capital trusts, trying to integrate the value of nature in economic decision making. I'll focus on the kind of restoring nature, which really touches on a lot of the work we do today. So just to give you an idea of how WEMP is set up, WEMP, the West of England Nature Partnership, is the partners. So our board is made up of the 4 local authorities in the region, the combined authority for the region, slightly complicated political setup, some environmental NGOs, so my role is hosted by the Avon Wildlife Trust, water companies, some of the national bodies at a local level, such as Natural England, and then also we engage with the National Farmers Union, the Environment Agency, and our local catchment partnership. So the board is a kind of cross-section of the environmental stakeholders in the region, which enables us to work in partnership. But it's not just the board. The wider partnership includes lots of stakeholders across the west of England whom we engage with through general communications, newsletters, a yearly conference. So we really are trying to bring together everyone in the west of England interested in the natural environment to work together to achieve nature's recovery. So our vision, having spoken kind of in the areas we work in, our vision is a thriving and well-connected natural environment in the west of England that underpins a healthy and resilient society and economy. So we kind of see ourselves having 2 main streams of work at the moment. One is nature recovery, and that kind of is embedded within spatial planning, economic development, etc. But it effectively is about delivering the recovery of the natural environment in the west of England. And the other, as I mentioned, is nature and health. There are some relationships between the two, but I was speaking about nature recovery today, obviously. So why do we need a nature recovery network in the west of England and across England? And obviously Rob and Nina both spoke to this a bit, so I won't try and repeat too much, but effectively we're trying to reverse the decline in biodiversity and the ecological crisis, which has lots of impacts, not just on wildlife, but on people, given how reliant we are on a natural environment. So there are plenty of statistics I could throw around. Just in our region, in the west of England, we had an 88% decline in lapwing in Avon between 1987 and 98. That's a wading bird for those who aren't familiar. And a 90% decline in greater horseshoe bats in the last century in our region. And this region has 20% of the remainder of that rare species in England. So there are so many other stats we could use, but effectively wildlife is declining and it's declining quickly, and we need to act. Also, we need to help address the climate change emergency to create habitat to sequester carbon, also to enable species to adapt to the climate change emergency. So in the 25-year environment plan, the national government committed to develop a nature recovery network across England. And we've already mentioned those Lawton principles of bigger, better, more, and joined up habitat that was highlighted as key to delivering nature's recovery. So that kind of joined up element is really imperative here in terms of delivering a nature recovery network. We need habitat to be joined up so that species can travel through it across the west of England and effectively give a larger area for species to thrive in without barriers. So our starting point for a nature recovery network, having identified the need to develop a nature recovery network, we'd already mapped in 2016 ecosystem services maps across the west of England. So as part of that, we'd identified where our existing core habitat was. So this map, for instance, is showing core areas of woodlands greater than 0.5 hectares in size across the west of England in green. So that's our core woodland habitat. And in yellow, it identifies where the best opportunities are to deliver additional woodland in the region based on proximity to existing woodland, soil topography, etc. So this was mapped using national and regional data sets. We also had a map for grasslands and maps for opportunities to deliver improvements in water quality, natural flood management, etc. So this is what we kind of had almost the first step towards developing a nature recovery network. You can almost see the seed of it here. You can see where we've got existing areas of woodlands and where we could deliver new ones, but it doesn't really show how those woodlands are functionally joined up across the landscape. So what we need to do was develop a way of showing how species were able to travel between those core areas of habitat across our region. So I'm now showing you a map of grassland in the west of England. Those red areas are existing areas of grassland. It's obviously quite sparse, but we do have some kind of strong areas of grassland. So the methodology we used was to take our core areas. So we used woodland, grassland, and wetland as modelling our habitat types across the west of England. So for grassland here, for instance, we take our core areas and then we need to find a way to model the permeability of the wider landscape for grassland species in the west of England. So obviously grassland species can travel fine through actual grassland, but other habitat types are less able to travel through. So for instance, they could travel a bit further through scrub than they could through urban areas or roads or intense agriculture. So effectively, you take your land use types across the west of England, which we had mapped. So for instance, some land urban, some land agriculture, some land woodland, some land grassland, etc. And for each habitat or land use type, you apply a permeability costing to reflect the fact that, say, grassland species can travel further through some habitat types than others. You then apply this permeability costing to the landscape across your region, and then you can model how far species are able to travel between grassland sites. So in this map, for instance, you can see that there are kind of broader areas of orange sites, which are which are connected. So that's basically showing that between those red grassland sites, grassland species are able to travel through that green corridor between areas of grassland using, say, scrub or woodland. In those white areas, those species aren't able to access. Now, it's obviously worth noting this is very much a model. It's taking a kind of single species to represent the wide array of grassland species in the west of England. But as I'll speak to when we're talking about the kind of challenges and successes, I think you need that simplicity to enable you to engage with stakeholders and make the maps simple to use. So this methodology has also been used in other regions, and it's recommended in the Wildlife Trust's handbook for nature recovery networks as well. And there is a methodology document available online on the website for further detail on this. So once you have that kind of modelled ecological network through which species can travel for grassland, you then can interpret that together with local knowledge, priority habitat maps, and habitat maps outside of our region to ensure that regional join up. And you map your core arteries through which you're saying that, for which you're saying that focus should be placed on habitat restoration to create this nature recovery network in the west of England. So these yellow areas we're saying is our strategic network, our core arteries through which grassland species can move, and where we need to focus improving connectivity so we can create a kind of resilient and coherent ecological network in the region. Now you can see, for instance, there are some big orange areas that are connected and that aren't strategic networks. That's because they're really important for wetlands, so you need to consider also your woodlands and wetland networks when saying where your focus needs to be. You also have these black spots, which effectively are connectivity gaps. That's showing where there are gaps in the modelled network and opportunities to fill gaps based on that earlier modelling I showed of opportunities to deliver grassland and woodland creation. So our kind of key outputs of this map are our strategic network and our connectivity opportunities. So this is repeated for woodland as well. Same methodology, the only difference is that we also mapped it for ancient woodland, recognising the key role that ancient woodland plays in nature's recovery, given its importance for a wider range of species. So you again end up with a map of the woodland strategic network, that's a kind of paler green here, and your existing woodlands in dark green, and then these connectivity opportunities you can see. So again, you start to identify where your key corridors are, when the opportunities are to create a coherent network that allows species to travel, for instance, from south to north here, or for instance, maybe east to west along these routes. Wetland is a bit different. You can't use the same methodology, or at least no one's figured out, I don't think, a way of using the same methodology for rivers, for wetland areas, because rivers are obviously linear and in a way they're already connected. There are different factors that impact the ability of species to travel through rivers in wetland areas, and I can't say I'm an expert on hydrology and wetland species, but effectively we mapped where the best wetland networks are based on our most important rivers, streams, lakes, important parts of our ditch network in the west of England, which is quite unique to the region, and coastal grazing marsh. and also the wetlands upstream and downstream of our most important habitats, so designated as triple SIs. It probably wasn't mapped, the wetland areas, with the same level of rigor as woodland and grassland. The methodology's kind of less settled on, and it's always something that's been debated when I've attended kind of national workshops, how wetland connectivity can be mapped. So as you'll see, I've got a big red under update sign at the top here, which might be a bit over dramatic, but we're currently working with our local catchment partnership, who have a lot of expertise on rivers, streams, the water environment in general, to produce a map that's more useful for those who work in that area. So considering things like water quality and barriers to fish passages, which are key in determining the connectivity of rivers and streams for wildlife. So these are very much, these are very much under update. We should have a more useful, more reflective map coming out soon. So effectively, you then combine all of these maps, and here I'm showing again the existing, say, woodland and grassland in darker shades, and the strategic network we identified, as well as those connectivity gaps as dots. So this is a kind of strategic map for use across the west of England, showing where we can focus our efforts for habitat restoration, and showing where existing habitat is already connected, so where we can focus on improving that connectivity further, creating better quality habitat in accordance with those Lawton principles. As I said, we've mapped woodland, grassland, and wetlands as separate habitats. And obviously nature isn't that simple. We do recognise that and recognise the importance of mosaic habitats. So I'll speak to the kind of challenges in a minute, but there's obviously something here about how you communicate the importance of mixed habitats when you're mapping a kind of simplified version of the reality of nature in the region. But this is very much intended for strategic use in our region. So it's at the West of England scale, and it's showing our key habitats, how they're connected, and the key networks in which we need to focus our efforts for restoration. And I think that's the key part here, is that it's not perfect, but it enables us to focus on creating ecological networks rather than taking a more kind of ad hoc approach. We can really focus in on the key areas for improving connectivity in our region. So I'll just talk through some of the challenges and some of the lessons that we learned when mapping this nature recovery network, and then when using it, because I think we were one of the first regions to map a nature recovery network, which obviously has its advantages in terms of getting work started early, but you do also learn things, and you can then share that with other regions, so they don't make the same mistakes, or can take those lessons on board earlier. So one of the key challenges we had was the accuracy of data we're using. Obviously, the maps to an extent are only as good as the data going into them. So for instance, in our region, some of the data on priority habitats and grassland especially is from the early 1990s. So that's going to be somewhat out of date as agriculture changes, there's intensification, etc. Additionally, national data sets we use for woodland might not reflect accurately on the ground knowledge of where our woodland is and how the quality of that woodland. And it's very difficult also to map woodland quality or habitat quality in general. How do we know how good a grassland site is, one grassland site is for nature compared to another? So that's something that needs to be dealt with, and I guess needs to be confronted early. And I think that while there are probably small errors at the very local scale, so at field level, what we try and communicate is that this is very much a strategic map for use in big, in strategic decisions, and isn't necessarily intended to be used at that very fine on the ground or field level. So when people are looking to use it at that kind of level, we very much highlight that they need to do on the ground verification. And this is a strategic map. It's a starting point, but it's not necessary. It's a model. It doesn't necessarily reflect the reality 100% accurately. I also just mentioned and touched on the habitat types. So how do you decide which habitat types to map? You can't map the complexity of nature completely. So you need to find some way to simplify things. So we chose in our region woodland, obviously that's the key habitat. Grassland, because of the importance of grassland sites in our region, it's quite a lot of dairy farming and grazing in our region, which makes grassland sites quite valuable. And obviously wetland areas. However, I know other regions have mapped, for instance, heathland or arable networks actually as well. So there is a kind of a debate to be had locally or regionally about what the key habitat types are and how accurately that reflects the on-the-ground situation. And as I just mentioned, wetlands, it is difficulty modelling wetlands. It was a bit of an afterthought, I think, initially when this was mapped. We're now trying to address that. I think it's better to include it, even though it's difficult to map, because if you don't, then wetlands tend to be forgotten. But there's a big question about how to model connectivity for rivers and wetlands, which I don't think has been answered yet. So that's something to bear in mind. And some of the key lessons in terms of making the Nature Recovery Network a success. One is that we found a partnership approach has been key to the success of our Nature Recovery Network and to buy-in. Effectively, we took a partnership approach from the off using the West of England Nature Partnership. And in my opinion, that's been crucial in ensuring that, for instance, local authorities feel like they own the Nature Recovery Network. It's not something that's been, for instance, suggested to them externally. They've been involved in developing it. So therefore, it becomes easier for them to use it in policy, in planning, etc. And that's true for other partners as well. So it does feel like a joint collaborative effort. Another is to make sure that you're working with experts across the region from the start. So local expertise in terms of ecologists, universities, policymakers is key in ensuring A, that you're getting the best quality data possible, B, that you're mapping the area accurately, and C, that you know what people want from a nature recovery network. So we used workshops, lots of stakeholder engagement, engaged with lots of ecologists and universities across the region to ensure we're getting the best expertise possible. The next thing to say is there needs to be some simplicity to the maps, or at least some component of the maps that's simple to interpret. So for us, I think that's the strategic network and the connectivity gaps. If you produce a very complicated ecological model and that's it, that's difficult for people to use. That's difficult for policymakers who aren't necessarily completely au fait with ecology and nature recovery to understand. So I think it's crucial to think about who's going to be using these maps, what they need to be used for from the start, and how it can be made as simple as possible while not sacrificing too much on accuracy. Understand your limitations in your terms of your data from the start. So how recent is your data, how accurate is it, and how can you adjust your modeling to consider that? And lastly, a lesson we've learned that we didn't take into account at the start, make sure the maps are really easy to update, because for instance, we're getting some updated mapping of habitat done at the West of England level. Ideally, we'd be able to just plug that into the model, run it again, and get an updated map in a day or two. That wasn't done when it was mapped, so that makes our lives slightly more complicated now, unfortunately. So I would just say, when it's mapped, make sure they're updatable from the off. So having spoken about the mapping process and some of those lessons, given we mapped this, the mapping was finished almost 2 years ago now, I thought I'd speak for 10 minutes about how we're using the Nature Recovery Network and how it's being used by our partners across the region. So one of the key documents, one of the key pieces of work in our region over the last 2-3 years has been a joint green infrastructure strategy for the West of England. So the idea of this is to have a kind of joint strategic approach to green infrastructure, so that we can secure investment in green infrastructure planning and provision similar to that of other infrastructure, so roads, railways, buildings, etc. Green infrastructure has been poorly funded compared to those historically, and also to enable a consistent approach to green infrastructure across the West of England. So this was developed last year by the local authorities and the combined authority for the region, with support from the Nature Partnership and other partners. And we're now in a stage of developing strategic green infrastructure projects to deliver this strategy, including delivering across these 8 green infrastructure outcomes outlined in the strategy, one of which was supporting resilient systems, ecosystems, and biodiversity. So key here, I think, was we ensured that the Nature Recovery Network was integrated into this document at an early stage. So it's a key piece of evidence for the document, and these strategic projects are now being developed to take that into account. So we have resilient ecological networks as one of the key outcomes of the strategy, and there's an action for the Nature Recovery Network to be used by local authorities to identify opportunities for ecological enhancement through their local plans and strategies. So this is an example of a nature recovery network being taken on board by local authorities and used in their planning and strategy making. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of biodiversity net gain. It's something that's in the Environment Bill for England. I'm not sure if it's also for Northern Ireland. Effectively, it's ensuring that all developments, housing developments, will be required to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain, effectively ensuring they're contributing towards nature recovery rather than detracting from it. So the idea is that this net gain should be delivered on site, i.e. on the housing development if possible. But if that's not possible, it can be delivered off-site. So the developer could buy land somewhere and deliver that gain in nature off-site. So that therefore provides an opportunity for us to use a nature recovery network to guide where that off-site delivery might be placed. So we've been working with the 4 local authorities to develop some guidance for biodiversity net gain in the west of England. So they're leading on that, and we're providing part of a working group working on that. That guidance could then be developed, embedded in local plans and development management in the region. And there's a question about how we use nature recovery network to guide biodiversity net gain. So we need net gain to deliver for the nature recovery network. And there are certain ways in which you might be able to use the mapping to try and target delivery of net gain in areas that would deliver the most for ecological connectivity and for nature. So for instance, could we prioritize offsetting habitats within those connectivity gaps we've identified? So this is something that's being discussed in the west of England with local authorities. It's very much an early stage, but there's some keenness to use nature recovery network in net gain. Something else we're working on at the moment, as Nina mentioned, was a tree and woodland strategy for the west of England. So this is being done through WEM together with our local community forest, the Forest of Avon Trust. Effectively, although we have a green infrastructure strategy, we have the nature recovery network, we've identified that there's obviously a lot of momentum behind tree planting, woodland creation at the moment because of climate change. People are very keen to plant trees to sequester carbon. What we don't want to end up with in our region or anywhere else is these kind of carbon landscapes where trees are planted purely for carbon, and we're missing an opportunity to deliver for nature, but also for people, health and well-being, for natural flood management, etc. So it was agreed that it will be useful to have a strategy for trees and woodland to ensure that we are taking a strategic approach to tree planting, to woodland creation, and also to ensure that we're maximising the benefits of tree and woodland creation. Effectively, we're trying to deliver the right tree in the right place. So effectively, this strategy incorporates nature recovery network into it. We have a kind of strategy for the trees and woodlands in the west of England. But we also have kind of key areas of woodlands we're saying could be focused on based on our nature recovery network mapping and ongoing work in the region to strategically deliver woodlands and trees in the west of England. And also what's probably as important as knowing where trees should go is knowing where trees shouldn't go. So for instance, having that wetland and grassland strategic network, we can start to identify areas in which trees and woodlands should either not go or should be done very carefully. And then we've also produced at the end of the document a set of priorities for each of the kind of sub areas of our region for trees and woodlands based on that nature recovery network mapping and local knowledge. So the aim is for this document to be used to inform local authority plans, strategies, tree planting in the region through funding received through DEFRA, and to target investment. We're hoping to publish that in June 21. And there's plenty of work to do around communicating that strategy and how we use that to help deliver the nature recovery network in the west of England.
5 minutes, please, Stuart.
Thanks, Nina. So if we're to achieve our vision of a nature recovery network, we also need to engage with agriculture. 70% of land in England, and I think this is true for our region, is in agricultural management. So we need to know how we can help landowners to deliver the nature recovery network. Again, in England, we have an agriculture bill that's refocusing agricultural policy and funding. So there are opportunities for us to use this new scheme to deliver or develop local priorities for nature recovery that can be embedded into agricultural funding in the region. So we've set up an agriculture working group together with our local catchment partnership to look at these questions around how, for instance, can we embed the nature recovery network into that agricultural funding regionally to encourage projects to be developed in areas that would make key contributions towards the nature recovery network and to better engage the agricultural sector in our region. Another key stakeholder for us has been engaging with the areas of outstanding natural beauty. So these are protected areas in our region, the Cotswolds and the Mendip Hills. They're developing nature recovery plans. Each AONB has committed to develop a plan for nature recovery across their protected area. So we're working with them to ensure the nature recovery network is embedded within the nature recovery plan, is used to develop that. So we have some consistency and we're not pulling in different directions and setting different priorities. So that also helps us to address the issue of how we approach cross-border nature recovery, how we ensure that our work is consistent with work in other counties, and we start to build that regional network rather than just stopping at political boundaries, which obviously nature does not recognise. Just a couple more slides. Obviously we've engaged with a wide set of stakeholders, and it's really important that we don't just engage with kind of local authorities, agriculture, the partners on our board, but we also engage with businesses, communities. So for instance, we've spoken with organisations such as Highways England and Network Rail about how we might integrate the nature recovery network mapping into their management of verges on their road and rail network. We've spoken to NHS bodies and universities, parish councils, so those who are have an interest in the land they manage or the land that's important to them. So really it's trying to get that idea of a nature recovery network out there to as many stakeholders as possible, because we really need everyone to help deliver this nature recovery network. And finally, there's an increasing recognition that we'll need a blend of private and public finance to deliver nature recovery at a scale where we have the ambition for. So we're using the Nature Recovery Network and other knowledge of what's going on in our region to develop a prospectus of Nature Recovery Network projects, effectively projects that would make a strategic key contribution towards the Nature Recovery Network in our region. So we've recently published that prospectus to projects online. It's very much a high-level guide to what's going on in the region. And the idea is that we could use that to help guide investment in nature recovery towards key projects that would make strategic contributions towards Nature Recovery Network, and also provide a single resource to know where which projects are ongoing and which projects we envisage happening in the future, even if they're conceptual at the moment, to deliver nature recovery. The plan then is to produce a kind of a map of those projects across the region. So again, to have that single source of what's going on and what could go on to deliver the Nature Recovery Network in the west of England. So thank you very much for listening. As I said, there's more info on our website, wemp.org.uk, including a methodology document for our mapping, our prospectus, and information on other work we're doing at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stuart. And I think Laura has been putting some of these links in the chat as well, just so those documents that Stuart was referring to. So if any of you were interested, they should also be there. Thanks so much, Stuart. That was fantastic. And I do really appreciate you being brave enough to, highlight those learnings as well that you've done along the way. And likewise, Rob as well. I think we could do a very, very quick poll before we let everybody have have a quick break. And I think especially in relation to what Stuart has been talking about in terms of delivering nature recovery networks as part of a partnership, we just thought that we would ask if you see a role for, let's say, a landscape or nature or land use partnership in delivering this sort of work in Northern Ireland potentially as well. Everybody seems to be very supportive of this idea. Interesting. So basically 100%, well, we've gone down to 99. Very much everybody seems to be in support or just slightly unsure of whether this would potentially be a model that could work for us too. Yeah, can you just share those results, please? Yeah, so we have 90% of people saying, yes, this seems like a sensible approach, and 3% then not being sure. Great. I will stop the sharing. And we are a little bit behind in the schedule, and that's mostly due to my inability to stick to the time scale I was given. So if we could all have a, let's say, 10-minute break now instead of the 15 as I promised originally, and if we could be back at 11:10. So if you could put that, Laura or Monica, into the chat as well. So if we could all be back at 10 past, and we can make sure we can brew ourselves some fresh coffee and tea to then continue after the break. So 10 minutes, if we could all be back at 11:10. Welcome back, everybody. I think we'll just give it a very short moment and then we'll get started. I guess, Hans, in the meantime, if you don't mind putting up your presentation and all that, so we're all prepped. In case Hans is still there. Great. Super. I think we'll make headway. Thanks a lot for that, Hans. I'll just do a quick intro and then I'll let you loose. So welcome back. I do hope that most of us have had the chance to replenish our caffeine sources. So before the Q&A, we've got Hans, who will give us an introduction to his work. Hans Visser is the biodiversity officer at the Fingal County Council in the Republic of Ireland. And for the last 10 years or so, he has been working towards bringing about this concept of ecological networks in his county. And that's been particularly through the Fingal Biodiversity Action Plan, but also through the the local development plan. The Fingal Biodiversity Plan was the first plan in Ireland to introduce the concept of a local ecological network on a county basis, and that was, like I said, back in 2010. And most of that model was actually based on the Dutch ecological network model, which Rob touched upon. A new draft of the current Biodiversity Action Plan is currently underway, and we'll see some amendments to the original network as a result of what has been learned in the last 10 years. And this includes, for example, the climate change measures focusing on wetland development and woodland development areas, which I'm sure Hans will be touching upon. So Hans, please do fire away.
All right. Yeah, no, thanks very much, Nina. Yeah, that's right. I suppose Nina asked me just to kind of share some of the experience that we have had in Fingal with developing our ecological networks. Now, just for those who are not too familiar with Fingal, we're basically one of the 4 local authorities in the Dublin area. We kind of cover North County Dublin. That county, like our part of Dublin, is still fairly rural. There's a lot of countryside left there. It's the sort of the fruit and vegetable basket for Dublin, so it's very intensive agriculture. We have around 50 kilometers of coastline with dunes, beaches, the estuaries. So we have the inshore area, the islands off the coast. So I suppose our county still supports quite a wide range of habitats and species, both terrestrial and aquatic. Now, at the same time, our county is also the fastest growing county in Ireland in terms of population. And basically what is happening at the moment, a lot of this natural habitat that we have get transformed into housing estates. So there's the obvious like rate of loss here is literally like because every year thousands of houses are being built in our county. So this rate is quite significant in terms of habitat loss of hedgerows and particularly countryside habitat types. But the second part of that as well, that all these new people also tend to use our coastline for recreational needs. So there's a lot of recreational pressure on our designated sites around our estuaries and the dunes and the likes of that. And so like that is having a knock-on effect at the same time, although in an indirect one. And now I suppose for us, when we started thinking about ecological network, like I suppose I would have been familiar with the concept already anyway. But I suppose the pressures that we're facing here are actually fairly similar to the Netherlands, where development pressure is huge as well. And the whole idea was, well, how do we find a way to kind of still allow our county to develop in terms of like housing development and roads development and industrial development, while at the same time protecting sort of our key sites and our key species. So that's where I suppose where the development of the ecological network came in. Now, when I started, there was literally no ecological information available to me whatsoever. This is about 20 years ago now. So what we first did is basically like a program of ecological research. We spent like about 10 years, because the funds were somewhat limited for all this work, about 10 years to do kind of finding out more about our habitats and the flora, our bird life, the mammals, fish, and vertebrates, just to get some idea, what do we actually have in our county? And a lot of that information then was just transposed into GIS. Stuart was kind of talking about it earlier on already. So we did something fairly similar where you took all your SACs, your SPA, like natures of all the mapping that was there, and combined that then with the habitat layers, the habitat maps that we had for the county, as well as sort of our GPS records of rare plant species that were found as part of the survey work. And I suppose that for the first time gave us some idea, I suppose, what we actually have in our county. Now, I suppose once you have all the information, I suppose, and the next step now, Nina actually did this story already in terms of core sites and buffer zones and corridors and the stepping stones. So I won't actually go into that, but I suppose fairly similar to what Stuart always said, like how do you build up your sites in that case? So our core sites are all our designated sites, so our SACs, our SPAs, our NHAs, the statutory nature reserves, but also Annex 1 habitat that was not actually included in the designated sites. So where it wasn't captured initially, we basically put it into this area. You kind of see, so in our case, our coastline where our SACs are and SPAs, and the islands, they were sort of our core sites. The other bit then are the buffer zones. In Ireland, a lot of the estuaries were designated up to the high water mark, not beyond. And it basically means that like the migratory birds that are here in their hundreds of thousands, basically do not just stick to the estuary, they also use the surrounding land for feeding. So if you want to protect those bird populations, you also have to protect the surrounding land. So we carried out a fair bit of winter bird survey work to see exactly where these birds are going, and the areas that are shown in yellow on these maps basically show more or less those key areas where they are. Similarly, with the wetlands, sort of here on the northern end of our county, the Geological Survey had done some survey work on that to find out the source areas of those wetlands. So again, if you want to protect the wetland, you also need to protect the source area where the water is coming from. So that's how we got to those core areas, or the buffer zones around the core areas. Nature development areas then. So again, these were sort of areas that we identified where there's great potential to combine the existing land use with nature conservation. So in this case, there's certain areas of farmland, there was golf courses, regional parks, the main landscape, there was areas that we identified for woodland expansion. So again, there's 7 categories of that, but the whole idea is more just to see that we actually want to work with landowners to kind of develop their lands to kind of enhance their lands for nature conservation, basically. And then to connect all of those with the corridors. Now, in our case, we're basically kind of using the river corridors. These were all mapped already. Now, from the survey work, we know that all the rivers have otters on them, there's bats on them, there is kingfishers on them. So these are all European species already anyway that are here. The rivers are not designated, despite those species being present. But I suppose by protecting the corridors, you also protect the habitat for these species, but also then providing movement corridors for species to go from one place to the other. So this is I suppose we don't have the countryside element of this. We still have a lot more survey work to do here because our initial survey work was mainly focused around our coastline and some of the already known sites of rare plant species, for example, in our county. that would have been recorded like a few decades ago. So we still I think this network will kind of grow larger as we kind of do more survey work, but it's just to give you some idea basically. And in total, then it makes up around 13,000 hectares of our county. So it's a fair chunk of our county base that's made up of this ecological network. Now, where does the county biodiversity plan fit in that case? Then this is basically a sort of coordinated framework for nature conservation. So there's various NGOs or other state agencies like working in our county, doing their own actions. And the whole idea is supposed to we're trying to get them to work towards one overall goal. So in this case, the county development plan or the biodiversity plan includes the actions that will actually help to deliver this network. So all the numbers that you see on the maps, they're all linked to specific projects to kind of develop this network basically. At the same time, our county development plan, also because the ecological network base is the bulk of what we call them the green infrastructure network. And you see sort of the hashed areas over here and like the river corridors and the buffer zones, they're all on our county development plan maps. So although these are non-statutory designations, they're now protected under the Planning Act. And that sort of, I suppose, has kind of helped us to kind of, I suppose, provide an additional layer. But and the way our county development plan is then linked with the biodiversity plan is where the biodiversity plan, if you want to develop in these particular zones, the biodiversity plan basically gives you the overview of the planning guidelines that apply to each of these areas. So in certain areas, because it's not so much the whole development, because that we couldn't do, but at the same time, it's more to kind of say, if you have a rare plant on your site, make sure that it kind of gets managed in such a way that you can protect it, and also or the habitat for it, and that you also don't actually build your house straight on top of it. Those sort of things. So it's more to kind of trying to work with landowners to make sure that we can keep the most important bits of our county, while at the same time allowing for development to take place. It also translated local, sort of at more local area plan level. So these are more sort of like parts of towns that get a special planning report done on it. And in this case, so this is next to Baldoyle Bay, where already at a very early age, we basically identify the need for areas for migratory birds. So it gets incorporated at the very early stage before any planning permissions are made, and they also get delivered before any of the planning permissions are made. So it basically means that we can actually protect our designated sites that way. Now, and like also on a smaller scale, this is sort of in the middle sort of our county, where we have the Royal Canal along the top and the Liffey Valley is to the south, where again, for future development already at local area plan level, we basically allow for sort of these wetland corridors to be incorporated as part of their SODS design to make sure that these wetland corridors basically can be maintained despite development. So again, I'm not going to say much more about that because my colleague, David Murray, is going to be talking about it next week, how sort of planning kind of can deliver the ecological network. But it just shows, I suppose, the link with the biodiversity plan and because again, it's one of the actions in the biodiversity plan to create this link. And I suppose my planning colleagues are now making sure that those things get delivered. Once I suppose you have it all on a map, that's all well and good, but how actually you're going to build it? And it just, I suppose, I just want to give you a few practical examples of that. So, how, for example, to deal with designated sites and the buffer zones. So in this case, this is an example of the Rogerstown Inner Estuary. There's around sort of 500 acres here in total. The 200 acres or so are owned by the council. And that was 200 acres owned by the council which had no particular designation. And it's usually when there's so much housing pressure, it's better to come up with an alternative plan before someone decides to rezone it. So at the moment, or at the time, it basically would have been sort of like from an amenity perspective, quite an attractive area, very scenic, the salt marsh, grasslands, woodlands, arable lands. There was some walkways in there, there was allotments in there and a bird hide. At the same time, it was also important for ecology, around 20,000 migratory birds that spend the winter there, but also species of otter, typical farmland species are declining, such as yellowhammer, and legally protected plants like meadow barley. So we have to make sure that we protect this as part of the overall plans. And then we just ask people, I suppose, we have all that land here, what is that you like to do with it? What would you like to see? So we did a lot of consultation with the local community about this, like the art competition with the primary schools and questionnaires for their parents and local residents. We went to a lot of local clubs, like the NGOs. And the whole idea here, I suppose, is to kind of get people's feedback on what it is they'd like to see and do there. And the main findings in this case, they actually wanted to see this area developed and managed for nature conservation. They did not want to see more pitches or sports facilities because like we have loads of those already. We actually want something different. We want to see more wildlife, but we also want to make this more accessible. And we wanted to see more woodland picnic areas. They want to diversify the landscape, which again, from a nature conservation perspective is good as well. And to see if we could actually turn it into an overall sort of nature education facility where people will learn more about wildlife. So in the end, we came up with a plan that kind of allowed for people for access, but kind of leaving the core area basically, like keeping people out of that, and that most of the recreational activities that will take place are actually away from the sensitive areas basically. So in this case, we asked people from the start, like what is it that you want to do, but also, do you want to get involved? Will you help us build it? So over around the 6-year period, the local community planted around 30,000 trees there. Now that's a lot of effort for like all the schools were there, various community planting days. Similarly, like we had volunteers kind of helping out, thinning out some of the woodlands there. And we had company out and some volunteers like installing the fencing. And then we did have to get some help from contractors to kind of for larger scale wetland development. But I suppose the end base was that we created a place that kind of both people and wildlife can use. And the whole idea by getting them involved at a very early age, or a very early stage, was basically because they had a say in what they wanted to look like, and they also were involved in the building of it. And it's that sense of ownership that comes off that you will need in order to protect these places in the long term. So those lads that I showed you there on the picture, they are in their early 20s now. And if senior management or councils decide, well, actually we want that rezoned, we're going to take away the woodlands, it's those people that can vote now as well, and they will be a hell of a lot more vocal if we decide to remove the trees that they planted. So again, it's that sense of ownership is really important when you kind of try to develop this. Similarly, like I suppose, like from other scales, where like we have regional parks and local parks, and again, that engagement is really important there too with the local community. Like in 2010, we decided to kind of run out like a growing places initiative where we let the grass grow and kind of get wildflower meadows, and there was a massive backlash against that because people did not want to see rank grass, and it's fine in a regional park away, but not in front of my house. So again, that level of engagement there, there was a lot more required than what one would expect. But it's even things like making your like parkland far less intensively managed. Instead of mowing it every 2 to 3 weeks, we also introduced grazing. So the whole idea there was more, and again, it basically put some life back in the parks, but it also from a nature conservation perspective, by using low grazing, low intensity grazing, it also was a lot more gain to be had in terms of wildlife. So again, it's talking to people and slowly changing the way I suppose we manage places. And you can also do it at a very low or at a very small scale. So in this case, you can see the picture on the left there. That's the road verge between Malahide and Portmarnock. It's an extremely far-rich area. It's actually of really good quality. So again, you can work with the tidy towns groups, for example, to actually deliver different programs. It does need a haycut once a year, which is quite tricky along a road verge like this. But again, it just shows, I suppose, with all the different scales, community engagement and kind of building support for your ecological network is really important. Now, the other thing, I suppose, and again, Stuart alluded to it as well, in terms of targeting agri-environment schemes. So instead of having more generic ones, make very specific ones that help you to build your ecological network. In our case, we ran, together with the Grey Partridge Trust, we ran a Grey Partridge reintroduction scheme. And the whole idea with that is basically we work with a number of farmers to put around 10 kilometers of habitat strips along the field margins. And the whole idea there is provide nesting strips and feeding strips for partridges and their chicks. But it's not only partridge that benefits from that. It's also yellowhammer, tree sparrow, stock dove, all the species that are declining in our county, birds of prey, again, pollinators, and then part of the hedgerow management associated with that as well. So we developed measures in this case. We got all the technical specs done for how wide do the strips need to be, what's the sowing mixes and all that. And that was then eventually incorporated into a GLAS scheme by the Department of Agriculture. So we thought, great, because that means we can actually expand the scheme. And it turned out basically that although the technical measure was fine, it was the red tape associated with the GLAS measures basically that meant that the farmers that even we had in it couldn't get in it or didn't want to get in it. So I suppose that's just a warning note as local authorities straying into agricultural measures that was something that we didn't expect. We did apply for ERP funding to kind of restart this project basically. and to run this ourselves, but we weren't successful in that. But I suppose even to note as well, if you want to have a viable population of grey partridge, you need around 400 hectares in total of farmland, and the annual sort of the cost of that, say, over a 5-year period is around 2.5 million. So it's around 500,000 euros a year, and that on itself is well beyond the council budget. So again, like, but at the same time, by actually using this measure, you could actually gain so much more. And I think that's really, I suppose, where a conversation with the Department of Agriculture are needed now for the next class round to make sure we can actually correct this and be able to kind of continue with this project again. The Ecological Network also provides great opportunities for nature-based solutions. So just here's an example where our health service was basically building a new forensic hospital, that's which is shown in yellow. The council owns a wetland next to that was drying out. So initially the HSE was proposed to build a big water storage attenuation tank on their own land. But we suggested, well, why don't you actually allow for the water to kind of flow into a wetland because it's drying out? And they were perfectly happy with that because it actually saved them around €500,000. And in return, they basically gave us a digger for 2 weeks to kind of carry enhancement works to the wetland, which was quite overgrown. So we have now a lot more open water features and everything in it. And we have fencing was installed, grazing was introduced. So again, like it was actually that was a win-win situation for us and for the HSE by saving like €500,000, but also trying to be able to do habitat enhancement works at the same time. And that was interestingly as well that these the domains are also nature development zones. So as part of their own development works, they also had to carry out woodland management works, woodland enhancement works, and they create new grassland, new species with grassland basically like on their holding as well. So that was just because if there was no nature development zone, they would not have done that. But in this case, they had to do it as part of their planning permission. The Nature Network also provides an opportunity for climate change demonstration projects. So in this case, we removed a kilometer of sea bank along one of the estuaries to increase the floodplain capacity and also to restore the natural hydrology of the site. Again, to develop salt marsh. So you can see the glasswork there, it's all colonized in the air now. So this was rank grassland, it's turning into something else now. But at the same time, so like from a climate change funding perspective, you know, for carbon capture and everything, or even for carbon offsetting by local authorities, that this is one way to actually do that. And this also might provide opportunities for carbon offsetting for private companies here in our county as well, where because we have identified a number of other locations where we can actually remove embankments to create salt marsh, and that would, like, I suppose, getting a better carbon capture rate than compared to grassland, for example. Similarly, we're looking at for woodland development sites, again, as a way of both offsetting the council's carbon, but also be able to kind of look at the wider community, the wider businesses to see where they can actually contribute to that as well. And similarly, like we're kind of looking at bigger sort of demonstration projects where you combine coastal flood defense with salt marsh development, with roosting and feeding sites for migratory birds, as well as a dune development project. So again, there's great scope to kind of use these network for demonstration projects or high-profile demonstration projects to kind of lift the overall sort of message behind these networks, that you can come up with some very innovative solutions to problems that are out there already and that are coming, or particularly in the context of climate change. Now, greenways, not necessarily an obvious one that you kind of would think of like the opportunities there, but I suppose in our case, because our county is developing so rapidly, we kind of want to see the coastal greenway as a solution to get people away from the more sensitive parts. So we developed this greenway in places where there's no impact on the estuarine wildlife, for example. But tied into that, where we want to go now is basically where, like, again, that the no net loss in terms of biodiversity, that we actually tie nature conservation projects into these greenway development projects, and that they will be part of that from the word go. So it means as well that if there's greenway development coming from central government, that they'll also, as part of that budget, they also have to fund nature conservation projects that are sort of located on either side of this greenway, whether this is wetland development or woodland development or estuarine sort of salt marsh development, could be anything. But the whole idea is to tie those projects into this, so again, you identify another source of funding. And raising awareness, or again, where you use your areas for the nature, the ecological network to kind of raise awareness. So that's where you take people to, that's where you take kids to, that's where you kind of get everybody to kind of to learn more about wildlife. So again, they can develop a better appreciation for it. In this case, we used to have a Trout in the Classroom initiative that we did together with Inland Fisheries, where primary schools had to raise well, baby trout basically from eggs. Was a lot of work for them because they had to come into school over the Christmas holidays. So they put a lot of effort in keeping them alive, and then in the end, like all the classes basically would come to the river and actually release the trout. So, but again, that gave kids that sense of ownership, and they actually learned a lot about sort of about fish, water pollution, water quality, and the likes of that. So again, you can use those networks to kind of target the whole raising awareness and outreach activities as well. Now, in terms of challenges, there's plenty of challenges, all right. I suppose it's a living network. It's continuously developing. I suppose as we get more information, like certain areas will come out because they were not classed correctly, or like we'll be adding new ones to it as more survey work comes in. We also have to kind of look at the fines. So like we have quite a broad network. We kind of looking at the small, more at micro, like, you know, in terms of boundary or town and hedgerows, do you kind of put them in, and also the connectivity into urban areas, to kind of basically to allow wildlife to move in and out of urban areas as well. The time and manpower requirement, I suppose we have 2 biodiversity officers, which is a bit of a luxury. I know most county councils in Ireland do not. But the time that goes into engaging with loads of people and with landowners and communities to do all this is phenomenal. And so I suppose in the end, like there's only so much time you have to actually do all this work. And I suppose like if you want to do this right, regular communication is quite important. So I suppose what we're finding that the amount of projects you can do in a year is quite limited. But saying that, I suppose we have a bit like the network that we have provides sort of a holding position at the moment, as we kind of do project after project to kind of enhance the sites. And that also kind of comes then to my next one. So clearly defined development objectives, because we get that asked that question a lot. So what do these river corridors that you have, what are they for? What should they look like? So like a lot of the rivers in our county will be drained to improve it for agricultural purposes in the past, and there's still some rivers that get drained by the OPW. They're like, so although the European species are still there, so the quality is not that bad, but they're certainly not natural river corridors. So the whole idea is for us now to specify in the next development plan exactly what we want it to look like. And you probably will be looking at more river restoration projects, the development of alluvial woodland, but also trying to figure out ways of actually intercepting farming pollution, for example, as well. And another big obstacle for us is land acquisition costs, say for nature-based solutions and climate change solutions. Or again, that's more around wetland development and woodland development. Like we calculated that it will take about 40 million euros over the next 10 years to actually buy the land alone, not even doing anything else, just buying the land is 40 million euros, and that's not the sort of money the council has available. So again, like we do know that there's big challenges there in relation to the funding model, and whether we can get indeed external funding from companies, particularly in relation to climate change, to kind of fill that gap. That's certainly an option we're currently looking at. And then finally, yeah, no, this is the last one. This is the last one. So in terms of the benefits, again, like by making these corridor, this ecological network or green infrastructure network, as we call it, multifunctional, it basically means that like every euro you put in it benefits a couple of different functions. So if you do put it in like money into a river corridor, you protect wildlife, you protect it from flood storage, for water quality control, amenity use. But it also works the other way around, where all those different sources of funding could also then be used to actually develop these ecological networks. So it's good value for money, and I think it's really important in terms of collecting capturing the collective effort by everybody. So particularly at the national levels, and what you're kind of looking at now in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of people working in that area already, and this will be actually one way to get all the different organizations together to work to one collective goal. And that's it.
Super, thanks so much, Hans. I think it was quite a lovely thing for us to get an example from geographically a little bit closer to home. And I think it was great to be able to highlight how a local council really can take action and push for this sort of work, you know, as long as the will is there. So thank you very, very much again, Hans, for taking the time for us this morning or almost afternoon now. So what we'll do now, we'll move on to the Q&A. Let me just share my screen quickly. If it lets me, great. As some of you have already, please put any questions that you would like to be posed to the panelists into the Q&A. I've noticed that some of our panelists have already been responding to some of them, but I think it would be quite nice to be able to actually discuss them on the screen as well. And I even saw a comment made by Rob towards, was it Heineken? So I think that definitely deserves a little bit of expanding on. So please use the Q&A functionality for that. If we have time at the end, we might take the time for also bringing up attendees onto the screen actually to ask questions from the panel. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. So we'll make sure that those questions that are already in the Q&A get answered first. Also, mark down, please, if you are putting questions in the Q&A, who you want to ask that from, whether there is one or more members of the panel. And also there's a box that you can tick if you would like to make your question anonymous. So that means obviously that not everybody know that it's a question from you. And once the questions start appearing, and some of them are already there, obviously, you will have also the option to upvote them. So if there was something that you wanted to ask as well, do click that, and that will get us an indication that that's of a higher priority, really. Anything else? I think we'll just get into that. So if all the panelists, if you could please turn your cameras on, and we shall then get you all on the screen, hopefully at the same time. And I'll make sure to pull up the questions as well. Yep, fantastic. I might selfishly start with a question from myself, and I think this would particularly go to Rob and Hans, but probably Stuart, you feel free to expand on that as well. But I guess we've been talking about species as part of this quite a bit, and I just wondered if Rob, you could maybe start. I just wonder what the role of individual species has played in the actual sort of decision making and delivery process, because we're obviously talking about functioning ecosystems and so on. So I wonder what the role of individual species and obviously rare species has played and should play, in your opinion, in the decision making.
Well, the individual species are kind of umbrella species. They are considered as focal species that can help to unite different stakeholders. There is a salmon project for the Rhine to link the Rhine, the spawning grounds of the Rhine, to the sea, and that is a 6-country project that could only be through an emblematic species. So you need one to bring it to bring the countries and the regional authorities together into a joint plan. So that was a plan from Switzerland, Germany, France, and the Netherlands. The Netherlands that was in the period that the Netherlands had a government that was not in favor of nature conservation, so they stopped the participation. And now you see that 4 years later, so since about 4 years, we have now re-entered that project. So we opened our estuaries for the salmon and other migrating fish because salmon is one, but the other is important as well. So the migrating fish are now coming in from the sea because we closed it in the 53. After 53, we had this storm, this enormous storm in the Netherlands where it's all flooding. So then we had this delta works. Things are closed, and that means the fish cannot go through. Now, well, the salmon project unites the countries to make fish ladders and fish ladders from the Switzerland and make natural rivers again in Switzerland, in Germany, in France, and also to make the whole river accessible for migrating fish. And it's called the Salmon Project because that's what everyone thinks that's the one. And the same is for otters in the Netherlands. The otter is an emblematic species for our wetlands. It was extinct. It had been reintroduced, but to reintroduce it, the water boards, the provinces, the local NGOs have all worked in making the water accessible and help them to pass roads. These all because they're very mobile. So that helps. And yes, but it's also with toads. Toads are not so very attractive for most of the public, but if you show them what the migration is of toads in spring, then it helps. And if you have the toads crossing, then also the snakes, the small snakes, and the other amphibians can go the same way. So that's why these species, finding the right species is very important. There was in Cheshire, when we were working there, they were implementing the Ecological Network for Cheshire, and they had the sand lizard as their species because they took the species and that was their guiding principle. So it helps, yes, to have such a thing like that.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Do you have anything to add to that, Hans or Stuart even?
Well, I suppose from our perspective, yeah, like protected species are important. Like say in our case, our estuaries, they have, I suppose, a large population of migratory birds. We're legally obliged to make sure that we actually look after our feeding and roosting sites. And that's not always popular. But like I said, there is no choice there. And I think that's why it's important to use protected species, because ultimately the law says you have to do so. And I think that has certainly helped in our case, the kind of funding for GPS tracking of migratory birds, for example, but also then I suppose to make the case where certain lands should not be used for housing or amenity use, or where we actually want to change people's mentality, where we have a lot of disturbance issues, that we have to be seen to actually do something about that.
Excellent, thank you very much. Did you have something to say, Stuart?
Just I guess that in our region and probably more widely, there seems to be been a shift over the last maybe 10, 20 years towards focusing on kind of habitats and landscapes rather than specific species. And certainly our Nature Recovery Network does that primarily for simplicity. But there is a question about how you then integrate in important species. By just focusing on landscapes, you put at risk certain rare species. So I think that's still an open question for us, how you integrate the two in.
Yep, thanks, Stuart. I guess a more of a high-level question has coming from Ben Ross, and he's indicated that that would be to all the panelists, but I guess it might be a little bit more relevant to especially Stuart down in England. So has there been any considerations how Nature Recovery Networks might actually be integrated into the 30 by 30 agenda? So that's the 30% of land and sea protected by 2030.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my view on this would be that Nature Recovery Networks provide us with a tool to ensure that 30% is doing the best for nature. So if we're saying 30% of land protected for nature, ideally we'd be using the Nature Recovery Networks to identify where corridors or large areas are that aren't currently protected but are valuable for nature, or where there are areas where we've got gaps in a network, for instance, that with protection could then form part of an active ecological network. I guess the challenge is, at least in the English context, is ensuring that protection actually means protection for nature. For instance, you've got landscape designations such as national parks and AONBs, and though those areas do a lot of great stuff for nature, they are landscape designations primarily. So working with, for instance, the areas of outstanding natural beauty to develop their nature recovery plans, I think and using the nature recovery network in that is critical. It can't just be 30% designated for nature, but actually it's not for nature. It really needs to be an active plan for nature within that 30%.
Great. Just a very quick note on you, I guess, Stuart. A question from Dawn, just because you were there talking already. Is the West of England Nature Partnership, is it funded by the central or the local government?
So it's funded by the local governments in our area, alongside the two water companies, Wessex Water and Bristol Water, and the Avon Wildlife Trust through hosting my post. I'm not aware of any examples of local nature partnerships that are funded by central government in England. It's all local funding.
Great. There's been quite a few questions around accurate environment schemes, and quite a few of you touched upon that already. I could read out this question which has come anonymously. Obviously, in Northern Ireland, we are predominantly a farmed landscape, and a lot of this is quite intensive. And obviously with Brexit, there is now a redesign really of this system here in Northern Ireland. I guess there's been a couple of questions I think that has come through from Tracy Platt as well. You know, is how closely has agri-environment targeting really been incorporated? Has it been incorporated into mapping at all? And how do you see that being sort of delivered through this concept, potentially through mapping going forward? And do you see that as an important role in delivering this work on the ground, without the kind of risk of, like you've touched upon, Stuart, of simplifying things too much and, you know, planting the wrong tree in the wrong place and so on?
Yeah, I'm happy to go on this to start, because we have set up an agriculture working group to work on this question in the west of England. In terms of the question from, I think, Tracy on how NRN mapping can be used for targeting, I think there's a really key role in that, at least in England. Again, I'm not sure what the situation will be like in Ireland, but the plan is to have 3 tiers of funding for agriculture going forwards. Tier 2 of that is local nature recovery. So that will provide funding for regional priorities for nature recovery through farming. So I think there's a real opportunity there for us to use that nature recovery network mapping to identify those local priorities for nature recovery. And there's also going to be a requirement to produce a local nature recovery strategy in the coming year or two, which will be based on our nature recovery network mapping. So I think that is a really good question around oversimplification. It's a really good question, because I think it could be used to identify kind of areas in which focus could be put to maybe create clusters of farms that are farming more extensively or in a nature-friendly way to make a key contribution towards networks. But you need the on-the-ground work to back that up. You need the expertise from local ecologists, local people to say, actually, that mapping isn't quite reflective of what's on the ground, or it doesn't capture the detail. And I do know that nationally, DEFRA in England, at least, is working on that question. And just touching on the kind of intensive farming and the role of CAP historically, the need for change within that community. Yeah, absolutely. We've kind of realised over the last year or two through the Nature Partnership, there's been just a complete gap between our strategic work on nature recovery networks and planning and the farming agricultural community. We're trying to address that through having increased agricultural engagement on our board and also an agriculture working group. And I guess the UFU is probably equivalent to the National Farmers Union here in England. So we are trying to work with them, and ultimately most farms are a business. So we're kind of at the mercy of central government funding. If you've got subsidies that encourage intensive farming, it's going to be intensive farming. Hopefully that is changing slightly, and it's how we kind of respond to that and use those tools to ensure that what's being done is being done in the best way for local nature recovery as well. So that exploring other funding options as well as public funding. I think in the west of England, we're looking at, or some of my partners are looking at things like catchment markets to mobilise private financing for nature-based solutions. So that's encouraging farmers to do what works for them financially. At the moment, that's intensive farming primarily, but hopefully with those changes in private public financing, that will move towards nature-based solutions being financially viable and attractive for farmers.
Would you have anything to add, Hans or Rob?
Well, like I suppose from our perspective, like we set up our own agri-environment scheme at a time with input from local farmers. Like they were just asked if they were interested in participating, and they had to set aside some land along their field margins, which is the least productive part of their farm. And actually that worked really well. It's once it got translated into a scheme by the Department of Agriculture that whole local coordination basically went. And I do think, from what I'm hearing, I think that there's much more of a move to results-based schemes, but it requires local coordinations. A lot of the EIP projects to see here in Ireland, for example, these environmental innovation projects, they're all led locally, and that really seems to be, I think, the way forward. And also means that the farmers can, I suppose, decide what sort of scheme they would prefer. Again, I suppose we're kind of looking from our perspective, we're looking at the least productive part of the farm, because I suppose at the same time, like the farms that we have here do provide a lot of food for Dublin. But it's more like, but we kind of found that like if you actually just set aside a little bit of that farmland, that you can actually have a lot of biodiversity gain. All your target species will benefit of that measure. But again, it's more the scale at which you need to do it, and the annual remuneration required to achieve that is quite high. And even I suppose when we were kind of looking like to run a scheme like that ourselves, when we kind of put the options to both farmers and the public as to whether we want to spend €500,000 on an agri-environment scheme every year, say for a 5-year period, because you spend €2.5 million, and at the end of that, if there's no funding, all the gains that you have made in terms of habitat creation will all be plowed up. So one has to ask the question, is that a sustainable use to kind of for that funding? So what actually came forward then, what they were suggesting, well, is there scope for rewilding to basically buy the same amount of land ultimately to actually set it aside for a rewilding project to kind of recreate the necessary habitats for those species? Because although we consider them typical farmland species, at some stage these species before farming was there, they had their own habitat types as well. So the whole idea is just to see, could you actually, does rewilding have a scope in that to actually spend your €2.5 million on buying land to achieve the same result? So again, that was just a consideration that came both from the farming community as well as ourselves. So.
Yeah, and obviously that it comes back to, there's a comment that has just come through, you know, how these agri-environment schemes tend to be short-term. So for anyone involved, including the landowners, you know, it's important that we create these opportunities, that we're not just thinking about, you know, what it was, but also what could the approach be long-term. I think this fits quite well back into, you know, how all of you have really talked about engagement and, you know, how do we work on this together, really. I wonder, there was a question, I think that was but from Brent Ross as well. He says, we've heard interesting examples of putting nature networks into practice and the levels of engagement with stakeholders in this process. Do any of you on the panel have any reflections on how this should be done and how you potentially could have even done this better if you could, you know, learn lessons from the past? Mindful of Hans's example of at one of your sites asking people of what they want and so on. And I know there was a couple of other relevant questions as well beyond, I guess, the public. Also, this was from Victoria Magrian. How important has it been in terms of buy-in as well, and not just from other stakeholders, but specifically from cross-government departments, and how would you engage with them? And obviously that then feeds into finance, infrastructure, communities, health, and all that. I know you've touched upon a lot of this. I wonder if there's any sort of obvious lessons learned or keys to success there that you would be able to identify. Any takers?
Yeah, I would say something. Involving, I answered already on the Q&A, this part of this. One of the things, if you have to want to involve landowners, it depends very much who they are, in which situation you are. I worked, as I told us in one of the Q&As, I worked in '93. I was in the Czech Republic, and there were farmers just getting back their land, and they had 3 reasons to build a hedgerow that still exists. The one was preventing erosion, because of Moravia, the big plains, and the communist period, it was all hedgerows, all small forests was gone. So they wanted to prevent erosion. They wanted to have a Sunday walk, shoot a rabbit, and have some nice landscape again, what remembers them from the past. So that's what their reason was. And that was combined with the biodiversity targets of the local NGO. And that works. And so these stakeholders, but when we were working in Cheshire with the Cheshire County Council, there are 5 landowners in Cheshire. Among one was the Duke of Westminster, who owned 80% of all Cheshire. And that meant that they only could start after his blessing, then they could start to develop the ecological network. And that means you have to look very careful at your local situation, what you can do. And in the Netherlands, for instance, there are regions where the stakeholders, the farmers, are not willing to, and regions where farmers are very much willing to cooperate. The same for Britain. When I was involved in the countryside survey, it's very different for every region. So you have to look at it again. Where can you work, and where is it the more difficult, and how do you have to approach your stakeholders? And the other thing is, when you saw that corridor that in the center of the Netherlands, that only could be realized by the local NGO, by the regional NGO, the plan, but they had to convince the national government. That was not too difficult, but also the regional government and the local municipalities to get to cooperate with them, because the funding was from them. And if you want to have long-term funding, and if you have to realize bridges and green corridors, then you need to have them. So you have to analyze first very carefully who I'm talking with. What is my social environment?
Finding that middle ground, isn't it? Because it's not like we are trying to do this, on our own and pushing our agenda. It's about finding that agenda together, isn't it? And having those conversations as part of that obviously is crucial.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add, Hans or Stuart?
I just I think that came up in a separate question, but it's related to this as well. The kind of nature and economy. I think we've found that in terms of engaging local government, businesses, etc., you do need to speak to the financial benefits of this, and there are a lot of them. So people generally like the idea of restoring nature. people like the idea of kind of contributing towards having more nature and forming part of this nature recovery network. But at the end of the day, apart from the kind of charitable funding you'll get, most of the funding, there's a huge pot of private finance there that could be used if you make the right arguments. So for instance, organizations have carbon reduction targets, or a water company might find that it's cheaper to invest in nature-based solutions to improving water quality than hard capital solutions. So I think we need to make a real concerted effort to integrate this idea of a nature recovery network in with that. So how do we encourage businesses to invest in nature, so there are financial benefits for them, but also for nature? So woodland creation, again, that carbon sequestration is really important. We just need to make sure when we're doing that, that nature doesn't get lost. So you start talking about woodlands for carbon, for instance, and then suddenly you find that actually the best woodlands for carbons are Sitka spruce because it grows really quickly and sequesters carbon really quickly. We need to make sure that we're integrating in those kind of more subtle economic arguments, such as health and well-being for people, that don't perhaps have such a clear, tangible financial output, and biodiversity. So communicating, I guess, the importance of biodiversity for businesses functioning. There's an approach we're using in the west of England has been created elsewhere called landscape enterprise networks. And that effectively seeks to engage with businesses to tease out their reliance on landscape and the reliance on the ecosystem services within that landscape. So for instance, a dairy company's reliance on sustainable soil, and get them to pay for those services that they benefit from, rather than kind of, I guess, free riding on the services that the natural environment provides. So there's lots of tools out there such as that, and natural capital and catchment markets, all that's seeking to draw those links between businesses, finances, the wider economy, and the natural environment. And I think that's really key.
It's all of us being opportunistic while smart at the same time too, isn't it? And bringing it all sort of together. And that's certainly how I kind of see nature recovery networks as an opportunity for us here, as well as a bit of a tool to provide that integration through all of these streams.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Rob or Hans?
Well, I think the communication piece is probably one of the most important ones. I suppose again, so when we did the big master plan for, say, the estuary, the reason why you're asking people what it is that you want to see and do is to find out some commonalities where nature conservation can benefit as well. So it's not to say that people get everything they want, but at least you kind of have a better understanding on what they like to see and do. And it comes back to what Rob was saying as well, that once you talk to farmers too, like some of them is like, oh no, get out of here, don't want to see this. Like again, with a Partridge project, I went to a fight like this, one of the neighboring farms every year, and he started laughing when I was coming, because he knew what I was going to ask him to see if he was going to participate. And every year it's like, no, I don't think so. So I came back the following year and kept on trying. The whole idea is supposed to kind of, I think it's those local links that ultimately are important. So like similarly, like with the Partridge project, where the farmers that we included were actually the heads of the Dublin Irish Farmers Association. And the whole idea, they were basically ambassadors for that project. And the whole idea that other farmers came to look on their farm to see what they were doing, because they figured if they can do it, then like, and if they're okay with this, then it can be done. I don't know if it's the same in Northern Ireland, but there's definitely some trust issues between the local public and state agencies in Ireland anyway. And they usually get accused of, we have no idea what we're doing, and it's not in their interest, or various of those sort of arguments. So the whole idea, I suppose, that communication piece is your first, I suppose, approach to people. What do you think of this? And if you don't do it, so like during COVID, we, for example, discovered that certain, like that in Donabate, a town near one of the estuaries, people are actually starting to use the foreshore of the estuary as the recreational space, walking their dogs, playing with the kids, but that was also the main roosting site for all the migratory birds in the entire estuary. So we closed that off, and I'm still dealing with phone calls nowadays, but for angry people, like, well, why did you close that off? And so again, if you don't communicate enough, or like, because we literally closed it from day one to the other, because we suddenly started seeing this. So we had to do a lot more communication, and afterwards to kind of explain to people, this is why we're doing it. Once people know the reason, it's fine. But just kind of doing stuff like this, because a lot of people kind of enjoy their locality, and they kind of have a sense of ownership and a sense of pride in it. And once you start messing with that, if it goes wrong, you'll spend a lot of time dealing with those issues where you should be I suppose, spending their time on more productive ways of communicating with people.
Thanks, Hans. Stuart, you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, it was actually just a quick answer to one of the questions posted in the chat regarding what I was just saying. Is that okay, Nina?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so someone asked what examples of the economic response and showing the contribution of natural environment is key. What examples are there of that? Certainly in England, there's a lot of stuff going on this front at the moment. The Environment Agency is working on a tool for natural capital accounting, so showing the value of the natural environment across each region, and that's being trialled in our region and I think elsewhere. So hopefully there should be a kind of tool out there at some point showing how you can take your land use and show the natural capital value of that. But I think probably more interesting in some of the tools I mentioned, drawing those links between businesses and natural environment. So there's something called landscape enterprise networks. As I mentioned, there are lots of examples of kind of catchment-based schemes at the moment the water companies are using. So you can look at Wessex Water doing lots of that work in the south of England. They've got a scheme in Port Harbour paying farmers to farm to reduce, I think, nitrate pollution. In our region, they're looking at the idea of developing a wider catchment market to effectively provide a marketplace for businesses to engage with landowners and pay them for the services they provide. There's also a Greater Manchester Have an Environment Fund. There are other examples of people looking at creating a fund for the natural environment and then strategically investing that fund where it would have the most benefit. So there are lots of things going on. I think it's all relatively embryonic at the moment, but there are also examples of things such as green bonds and green finance. Again, that are, I think, quite early stages, but there's lots of potential tools you could use to leverage in that investment in the natural environment. So I think it's worth exploring that in that context.
Yep, thanks, Stuart. Anything to add, Rob or Hans? Shall we move on to the next question?
No, go to the next question.
I guess it would be quite nice to go back to the ecology side of things, which is probably what gets us all excited here. And there's been a question, quite a good one and an obvious one, really, when it comes to building connectivity. So the question has come through from Ben Ross. And it says, when considering the development of networks, increased connectivity, and all of the benefits that this can and will bring, are there any benefits or risks, and how can we mitigate them? Thinking here in particular about increased connectivity for invasive species, for example, and this is certainly a conversation that we've had here recently with red squirrels and grey squirrels, for example. Would you, especially would you have any examples of where you've gone through this decision-making process and where you've had to take into account, the risks of delivering connectivity as well?
Invasive species have the habit of moving very easily through the landscape. They don't need so much connectivity conservation. They come there anyway. That's why they are invasive. And we see, for instance, here the Rhine system, that when they built the Rhine-Danube canal, so the linkage between the two river systems, that the Danube species were invading the Rhine system. And they are overtaking part of the habitats of the Rhine species, because the Rhine species are more Atlantic, have not such a harsh climate where they live in. They apparently are not as strong as the Danube species. So you see them coming in. You see the American crab coming in. So you don't have to protect them. They come there anyway. And the only way is don't let them come in. But that's not a thing that you do by preventing their movement through the landscape. They do it anyway. You have to you need corridors for carabid beetles on a very small scale, because they walk very small distances, and you need them for toads. You need tunnels for toads, And of course, other species will use these tunnels as well, but that's, well, you have to, if there are invasive the other species, then you have to find a way how to prevent, how to get rid of them. And that's the difficulty. But it's not the corridor that is facilitating them. They are facilitated anyway by being introduced in an environment where they are more competitive than the other species.
So basically, sorry, for a moment I was worried that my Wi-Fi was down. Yeah, so basically what you're highlighting there, that those invasive species, you know, they are going to get to that landscape through, you know, for different reasons, but how you need to be aware of those species before you put in place connectivity, and as much as you can actually get rid of them before actions are being taken, because otherwise obviously the species are, like you said, most likely going to be there anyway, but ensuring that we're not improving their chances of expanding elsewhere within the landscape.
We have a former colleague of mine was working with invasive insects, and they come in the crates, in the wood of the crates that come from China, and things are taken out of the crates, and the wood is put on a dump, and from the dump they go, and then someone sees a strange insect and warns us. Then you go there, and then you have to clean up a part of the land to prevent that species to damage. For instance, there was an ash. I don't know how it's in English, but it's a beetle that eats ash, and we have a lot of ash trees here. So you want to get rid of them before it's moving into the wider environment. So these are the things where you should look at if you talk about invasives. How come do they come in?
Biosecurity before they even arrive would be the key, wouldn't it?
But if they are there, it's too late.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it isn't as if it was just as simple as saying, you know, we can prevent them from coming in. We know just how challenging that is, but you're 100% right though, Rob. It's incredibly challenging to deal with invasive species once they are in the landscape, especially the smaller they are.
And there is this. There are people at they call CH who working on this, who used to work on this kind of species. I don't know if they're still there, but you have to get you have to have a network of people in the country who are aware of these kind of invaders. Then you can prevent them to expand.
Yeah. I can see there's been a message from Catherine as well with a link in chat with a lot of useful information just to make that point. Would you have anything to add, Hans or Stuart?
Just very quickly, I'm certainly not an ecologist like Rob, but I guess the other thing to note is if habitats are managed properly and in a dynamic way, so things like rewilding or extensive farming systems, then that hopefully should decrease the opportunity for non-native species to establish, or certain non-native species to establish, if you have more dynamic ecosystems. So I guess that's another reason to highlight the need for those more natural processes to govern.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what Rob said as well, you know, it just highlights again that importance of us all working together. So it only is going to make these sort of approaches and ensuring, especially as an example in case of invasive species, that we're all, you know, working towards this shared goal, and we use the best practice in all this, and obviously that's all about what we're here today for. I guess to go back to the kind of engagement and kind of being opportunistic as well. So I apologize for backtracking as well, but I think this was quite a useful question actually from Tracy Platt in terms of getting some examples as well. And I think that was, and I think you responded to this already in the chat, Rob, and she said, Rob, that was incredibly inspiring. Who is the most difficult to engage in realizing the networks in, for example, government or public bodies? Are there, and at the same time, are there any large corporates that you're aware of or other industries who have actually, raised interest or are already doing or involved in this sort of work, in funding such projects, or even, in practical terms? And I think, Stuart, you might be able to expand on this a little bit as well in terms of, the NRN partnership approach in England as well. And Hans, do feel free to expand if you have any comments.
Who do you want to answer?
Rob, could you go first, please?
Okay, good. There is industry that is interested, and that means there's industry that has a connection with some part of the landscape. So I gave the example of Heineken, who has a estate next to his biggest brewery, and they wanted to share the estates partly with the region, and also to have some experimenting with crops for their brewery. So they combined it, and together with my colleagues of mine, I was not involved in this project, but together with the colleagues of mine, they developed that estate further so that it could be used as an example plot, etc. It was a quite big one, and also it was accessible for the region. What another groups that are very much involved in it is the gravel mining industry and the clay mining, and also what we had a cement factory in the south of the Netherlands that unfortunately excavated a big part of the Petersburg, very nice mountain. But now at the end, they have been discussing with Natuurmonumenten, our Nature Conservation Society, and have agreed with them to, at a certain stage, to leave the mountain as it is, and now it's redeveloped as nature with their investments and investments of the Nature Conservation Society, and now it's an area you can walk, but also where the uhu is breeding, and all kind of birds and all kind of reptiles and mammals are living now. And it's also close to Maastricht, a big town. So a part of it is guided, is open for the public. So there you get, well, there has been a destruction, but the destruction has not been totally, it has been stopped at a certain moment and returned into nature. And that has also done along the river. We have to, the Rhine and the Meuse, we have to get more space for the water, for the river. And the gravel pit, the gravel miners are cooperating with the NGOs who are planning new nature, new river nature, and that has been developed on several spots along the river, on all the rivers. And so, well, they win, they get their gravel, and they deliver, they leave the pits in such a way that it is easily to make new nature out of it. So it's not too deep, it's well, with islands, etc. So it's done that way. And also the lottery does do things. So it can be done, But well, it's not, of course, not every industry who is involved or is willing to be involved, but some are.
But there is interest there.
Yeah, there is, but it takes time.
Yeah, of course. It's again about building those relationships and that rapport, isn't it?
You have to build the business case for that certain industry.
100%. Would you have anything to add, Stuart or Hans? I think we need to be closing in soon.
I think from I suppose our perspective, I suppose really one of the main things I think we will be missing is the national initiative. There is no national ecological network, and the kind of I think it would be a fantastic opportunity where, say, the networks that you're developing in Northern Ireland would actually be done at the same time as the networks in Ireland, so you actually have a nationwide ecological network that we kind of connect into. I suppose our system is still very much a standalone. Yes, we can connect into neighbors who don't have an ecological or green infrastructure network either. So I suppose there's definitely more done that needs to be done at national level here as well, I think, in order to kind of progress this and kind of put that on a better footing. Because it's even dealing with, say, like big flooding problems along the Shannon River, where indeed what described those the solution that Rob mentioned there, that you can actually do much more creative projects there instead of just, oh, well, we'll build a flood wall. Instead of actually just developing, I suppose, helping the Shannon River itself to recover at the same time. So,
but there has been a study on several studies on the ecological network for Ireland. Years ago, I was speaking to Mary Tuberty, and she was working on such a national network, but I never saw the result, the final result, being implemented.
No, that's correct. The study was indeed done. And shortly after that, I think it was the National Parks and Wildlife that wrote an advisory note that didn't think it was necessary to develop ecological networks. I think if they've come around, I think they've come around now since, so this is a long time ago, they've certainly come around to the idea. It's also in the National Biodiversity Plan, but I don't know who in the National Parks and Wildlife Service has the capacity at the moment, time or money-wise, to take on such a project. So I'm not sure if this is going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, were you saying something, Rob?
No, I said okay. It was nice to hear, but it could be, and especially if you take the European funding on green infrastructure, and there is interest in the country, then it could be done. But you need both sides.
Yeah, 100%. And I think this whole, just add on what was mentioned on earlier, this whole cross-border working, but also cross-county barrier working when it comes to data sharing and all that, would be potentially a topic of discussion for a whole other workshop. But it's definitely something that I'm sure we have all, and we are here as well, will have to be aware of and deal with, whether we're talking about something national or something a little bit more local, both in terms of mapping, but delivery as well. But maybe we don't really have the time to go into that in a bit more detail today, but it's certainly something obviously that we have to be tuned to. I noticed that there was a couple of questions sort of directed more to me, and I'll refrain from responding to those because we're running out of time, and we obviously really wanted to have the floor open to questions to the panelists. But obviously, I'll just put a slide up very shortly, and you'll have my contact details there. So if you do have any questions directly to what we are working on and where kind of the point that we've gotten to so far, do get in touch with me directly. It's easier to do it that way. Obviously, there were questions, I think, around the likes of net gain and mapping as well, and data sets that we will be using. So the other two webinars that are coming up are going to be a little bit more relevant to those questions as well, and we'll be discussing them obviously with the panelists then as well. So it's worthwhile tuning into those. So really, just before I let you all go, I'm just going to go through this last slide very quickly, if it lets me. There we go. So Please hold on a couple of more minutes. We're just about to reach the end. So this is the very last slide, and we've got one last poll as well. So it's almost lunchtime, so hold on. Actually, I think before I even go to this slide, could we maybe do that last poll, Laura and Monica? I think it would be quite interesting to see, and be honest, everybody, I think it would be quite interesting to see just kind of what people's impression on what nature covering networks could mean for Northern Ireland, and whether that is something that people consider as a sensible approach for us after today. So there seems to be quite a lot of agreement that this all makes quite a bit of sense. Yeah, so we've got 100% agreement now at this point, saying, yeah, that that seems very sensible, and obviously that's, I would say that's a great outcome. Obviously, I understand, you know, the level of complexity and work and money and all of that would have to be involved, but it's great to see that as a concept, you know, is something that people are tuned into and see as something relevant. Great, thank you. So just really to conclude, I do really hope that you've all enjoyed today's session and gotten something out of that. I've certainly personally feel I've gotten a lot from today's session personally. So I think this was an excellent start, and like I said, the other two sessions will then dwell into a little bit more detail into the specific pieces of the puzzle in bringing about something like this as a concept. So do tune into those and sign up to those if you haven't already. And the details are there on the screen, but you should also have the links to those registration forms in the emails you might have received or on our Twitter page. But if you don't have access to those or can't find them, obviously you've got my email there and you can get in touch and I can share them with you. So obviously huge thank you to our panelists today. Thank you so much for taking the time to be involved and taking part in the Q&A at the end as well. I'm aware that we might have missed a couple of questions there, but I do apologize. We had quite a big audience. So thank you all then for being there and asking those questions. I think it was really good that we were able to have these conversations, and that was obviously what this session was all about as well. And obviously the thanks are not just on behalf of me, but obviously the wider partnership. I'm very much just the poster girl, I guess, for the project, being the coordinator. And there's obviously a lot of people, especially in the partner organizations, but other stakeholders as well, who are already involved and will be certainly playing a role going forward. But obviously we are still at very early stages, but this is exactly the sort of conversations that we need to be having so we can start, you know, progressing our work and do it in a way that is most appropriate. I would also really like to thank obviously our funder. If it wasn't for our funder, we obviously would not be running this project. So thank you very much for National Lottery Heritage Fund, because you've made this all possible. And last and by no means least, thanks also to my co-hosts Monica and Laura. You've been extremely helpful in launching the polls and helping everybody in the chat and sharing links and so on. In terms of what you could potentially be doing as stakeholders going forward, you know, do have a think, you know, whether your organization could potentially be someone who could get involved with this sort of work, and do get in touch with me. This could at this point in time involve sharing data and so on. So if you have a feeling that you might have some relevant data that you could be making available for our own mapping exercise, do get in touch. And also we will be sending out a feedback form to everybody just after we've finished today. And that will be asking questions in terms of how useful did you find the setup, and whether you would like to attend any further events or workshops. So please just do respond to those as well, because that obviously will help us to improve and plan our work going forward. And my contact details are there, so do pick that up in case you want to get in touch at any point. And I think we'll leave it there, and I will release you all to have lunch and hopefully enjoy some sunshine, which we weirdly are now enjoying in Northern Ireland, because we don't get that very often. So I think we need to take the opportunity to go and enjoy that. So thank you very, very much, everybody, in particular, obviously, for you on the panel today and my helping hands there for today. And hopefully we'll see a lot of you next week as well.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Nina.
you, Rob.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
All right. I enjoyed it.
Excellent.